In the luxurious first-class cabin of the plane, Barron Trump sat silently, his eyes gazing out the window as the golden glow of the evening sun bathed the tarmac. The hum of boarding passengers filled the air, but Barron barely noticed, his mind lost in deep thoughts. Suddenly, a loud, aggressive voice shattered the calm. "Excuse me, but what is he doing here?" The pilot's sharp voice cut through the air, his piercing gaze fixed directly on Barron. The passengers froze, their eyes darting between the pilot and the young man. Barron looked up, confused but composed. "Is there a problem, sir?" he asked, his voice steady, though the tension in the cabin was palpable. The pilot sneered. "Yes, there is. People like you don't belong here. This is first class, not some charity flight." A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Barron's heart sank. Not for himself, as he was used to scrutiny and criticism his entire life, but because of the hate in the pilot's eyes. This wasn't about a seat. It was something deeper. Ugly. Passengers began whispering, some pulling out their phones to record. An elderly woman sitting nearby leaned toward Barron and whispered, "Are you okay, young man?" Barron nodded, offering her a polite smile. But the pilot wasn't done. He stepped closer, pointing at Barron like a judge delivering a sentence. "I don't care who you are. You're not staying here. Move to another seat, or I'll have you removed from this plane." At that moment, Barron's calm demeanor shifted. He rose slowly, his tall frame drawing every eye in the cabin. The murmurs stopped, replaced by an expectant silence. "Sir," he said firmly, his tone calm yet unwavering, "I have a ticket for this seat. I belong here just as much as anyone else. If you'll excuse me, I'd like to enjoy my flight." The pilot smirked, crossing his arms. "We'll see about that," he said, before turning and storming back to the cockpit, leaving a trail of tension in his wake. Barron sat back down, his hands resting on the armrests, his expression thoughtful. He wasn't angry. He was calculating. Something about the pilot's hostility didn't sit right, and he wasn't going to let it slide. Unbeknownst to everyone on board, a storm was brewing, not just in the air, but in the hearts of those witnessing this confrontation. And what was about to happen would challenge everything they thought they knew. Time passed, but the tension in the cabin lingered like a dark storm cloud. The pilot hadn't returned, but his words hung heavy in the air. Barron noticed the worried glances from some passengers. A few seemed sympathetic, while others looked hesitant, unsure of what to do. A young flight attendant, her smile nervous, approached Barron cautiously. "Sir," she whispered, leaning slightly closer. "Is everything okay? I heard what the captain said. If you'd like, I can arrange for you to sit elsewhere." Barron looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment. "Thank you," he said softly, "but I'm not going anywhere. I have a right to be here." She nodded, a flicker of admiration crossing her face. "Just let me know if you need anything," she added, before hurrying back down the aisle. Then the unexpected happened. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, I regret to inform you that our flight is delayed due to a security concern." Barron froze. Security concern. The words clarified everything. The pilot wasn't just rude. He was framing Barron as a threat, a calculated move to justify his actions. Passengers began murmuring, their whispers growing louder. A man across the aisle leaned forward, his tone a mix of curiosity and unease. "Is he talking about you?" Barron didn't answer. Instead, he reached for his phone and opened the camera app. If things escalated, he wanted everything recorded. The cabin's tension grew heavier, and the storm building in the hearts of those present was about to erupt. In the first-class cabin of the aeroplane, 2 security officers entered, their eyes scanning the cabin. When they stopped in front of Barron Trump, one of them said, "Sir, we need you to come with us." The cabin buzzed with murmurs as passengers reacted. An elderly woman rose to her feet, her voice resolute as she protested. More voices joined her, creating a wave of support. Barron, however, remained calm and composed. One of the officers turned away to speak into his radio, while the other shifted uncomfortably under the weight of dozens of eyes watching him. Meanwhile, Barron stood tall, his demeanor calm, a stark contrast to the chaos around him. The elderly woman who had defended him earlier stepped forward, her voice firm. "I don't care who you think you are. This young man has been polite and quiet the entire time. If anyone deserves to be removed from this plane, it's the pilot." Her words reverberated like thunder, igniting a growing outcry among the passengers. "That's right," someone shouted. "We've all seen what's happening here." The pilot suddenly reappeared, his face flushed with anger. "Enough!" he barked, his voice slicing through the commotion. He pointed directly at Barron, his hand trembling with rage. "I don't care what these people say. This flight doesn't leave until he's off the plane." Barron turned to face him, his steady gaze unwavering. "And why is that?" he asked, his voice calm but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Is it because of something I've done, or because of who you think I am?" The question hung in the air, laden with implication. The pilot hesitated for a moment, caught off guard, but his stubbornness returned. "Don't play games with me," he snapped. "You might fool everyone else, but I know trouble when I see it." The cabin erupted in chaos as passengers shouted over one another. Some demanded the pilot's removal, while others called for answers. The security officers looked overwhelmed, unsure how to regain control. At that moment, a man from the back of the cabin stood up. Older, with a weathered face and the air of someone who had seen countless battles, he spoke with authority. "Enough of this nonsense," he said, his deep voice commanding attention. The noise subsided as heads turned toward him. "I recognize this young man," he continued, pointing at Barron. "And I think the rest of you do too. This is Barron Trump, son of the former President of the United States." A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Barron felt a wave of unease as the weight of recognition settled over the passengers. He wasn't ashamed of his identity, but he had hoped to avoid the spotlight, to simply exist without the burden of his last name. The pilot's face twisted into a sneer. "So what? That doesn't give him the right to act entitled." "Entitled?" the older man shot back. "The only one acting entitled here is you. I don't care who he is or isn't. Your behavior is unacceptable." The security officers seemed to sense the shift in the room. One stepped forward and addressed the pilot directly. "Sir, we need to de-escalate this situation. If you continue to provoke the passengers, we may have to ask you to leave this flight." The pilot's jaw dropped, his disbelief evident. Before he could respond, Barron spoke up, his tone steady. "I think we've had enough drama for one flight. If you'd like me to leave, I will. But know this, every moment of this has been recorded, and I won't let your actions go unanswered." The pilot looked as if he'd been slapped. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder, and passengers began raising their phones, some openly filming the confrontation. One of the security officers turned to Barron and said, "Sir, you don't need to go anywhere. Please take your seat." She reluctantly settled into the cabin. Cheers erupted from the cabin, but Barron remained still, a nagging feeling telling him this wasn't over. The pilot, red-faced and seething, pounded his fist against the cabin wall. "This is my plane," he yelled, his voice cracking under the strain of his rage. "I decide who stays and who goes." The older man stood again, his voice sharp but steady. "Your plane? Last I checked, this plane belongs to the airline, not your ego. You're supposed to be a professional, but all I see is a man drunk on power, trying to humiliate someone who's done nothing wrong." The words struck like a blow, and the pilot faltered, momentarily at a loss for words. But his silence didn't last. "This isn't about power," he snapped. "It's about rules, and I'm the one who enforces them." "Rules?" Barron interjected, his voice firm. "Tell everyone here which rule I've broken to deserve this treatment." The pilot hesitated, his eyes darting nervously around the cabin. He had no legitimate answer, and under the weight of public scrutiny, he struggled to find a way out. One of the security officers stepped forward again, his tone professional but stern. "Sir, you need to calm down. You're creating a disturbance, and it's our job to ensure the safety of everyone on board." The pilot's face twisted in disbelief. "You're taking his side?" he asked, his voice laced with venom. "We're taking the side of what's right," the officer replied. "And right now, you're the one jeopardizing this flight." The cabin erupted in applause as passengers voiced their support for Barron. The pilot, clearly outnumbered and outmatched, looked around desperately for someone to back him up, but no one did. Finally, realizing he had no choice, the pilot snarled in frustration and stormed back to the cockpit. "You'll regret this," he spat over his shoulder, slamming the door behind him. Barron exhaled deeply, the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time since the ordeal began. The elderly woman who had defended him earlier reached out, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "You didn't deserve any of this," she said warmly. "And don't worry. We'll make sure the world knows what really happened here." Barron nodded, gratitude evident in his eyes. Yet, as he sat down, he couldn't shake the feeling that the pilot's ominous words were more than just empty threats. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, the vague insinuations targeting Barron igniting murmurs throughout the cabin. Yet, Barron remained composed, his eyes fixed forward. The intercom cut off abruptly, but the unease lingered. Moments later, the plane jolted unexpectedly, drawing gasps of alarm. A flight attendant hurried down the aisle, her face pale as she tried to reassure everyone. "Just a little turbulence," she said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Barron, however, wasn't convinced. Instinct told him something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Then, he saw it. The silhouette of the pilot pacing back and forth behind the frosted cockpit door like a caged animal. The veteran sitting nearby leaned toward Barron and whispered, "That man's unhinged. He's not done yet. You need to be ready for anything." Barron's heart pounded, but he nodded, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He had faced public scrutiny, harsh criticism and unfair treatment before, but this was different. This was not about reputation. It was about safety. As the plane continued its course, the tension in the cabin grew unbearable. Then, as if on cue, the cockpit door flew open violently, slamming against the wall. The pilot stood there, wild-eyed and breathing heavily. "All right," he said loudly, his voice echoing through the cabin. "If no one else is going to do something, I will." Before anyone could react, the pilot stormed down the aisle, his gaze locked on Barron. Gasps and cries of alarm filled the air, but no one dared move. The tension peaked as the pilot loomed over Barron, his face twisted with rage. "You think you're untouchable?" the pilot sneered, his voice low and venomous. "Think again." Before he could take another step, the veteran shot to his feet, planting himself firmly between Barron and the pilot. His voice rang out, strong and unwavering. "You've gone far enough." The cabin fell into stunned silence. All eyes turned to the two men. One, a symbol of authority gone rogue. The other, a quiet hero, standing up for what was right. The veteran held the pilot's gaze, his voice calm but commanding. "Sit down and do your job, or I'll make sure you never fly again." A young woman stood up, holding her phone. "I've recorded everything," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "If you don't stop, this goes online and your career ends here." Her words rippled through the cabin as others raised their phones. Some had already begun live streaming the chaos. The pilot faltered, his eyes darting to the phones pointed at him. "You think you can threaten me?" he growled, but the conviction in his voice wavered. "Enough," came a firm voice from the back. The lead flight attendant stepped forward, flanked by two colleagues. "Captain, return to the cockpit now, or we'll have no choice but to restrain you." Outnumbered and outmatched, the pilot clenched his fists, his frustration boiling over. Finally, he snarled and stormed back to the cockpit. "You'll regret this," he spat, slamming the door behind him. A collective sigh of relief swept through the cabin, but the tension lingered. The tension lingered. The veteran turned to Barron, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You handled yourself well, son," he said. Barron nodded, gratitude shining in his eyes. "I couldn't have done this without you," he replied. By the time the plane landed, the incident had gone viral, with hashtags like "Stand with Barron" and "Justice the Skies" trending across social media. A crowd of reporters and supporters awaited them at the terminal. As Barron stepped off the plane to cheers and applause, the veteran stood beside him like a pillar of strength. A reporter pushed forward, microphone in hand. "Barron, do you have anything to say about what happened today?" Barron paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice steady and filled with purpose. "It's about standing up against injustice, no matter where it happens. No one deserves to be treated as if they're less than human. We're all in this together." Applause erupted once more. That evening, Barron sat in his hotel room, scrolling through messages of support. He knew the fight against prejudice and injustice wasn't over, but this was a step in the right direction. As he closed his eyes, Barron realized something profound. Sometimes, the most unexpected battles lead to the most meaningful victories. And in those moments, standing strong, despite the odds, can change the world. If this story has touched your heart, we'd love for you to share its message by liking and sharing it with your friends. Help us reach our first milestone of 1,000 subscribers. It means the world to us and allows us to create more meaningful stories for you. Don't forget to share your thoughts about the story and let us know which city you're watching from. Thank you for your support, and we'll see you in our next story.